Hello, everyone. This is Kenneth Paul Tan. Let's think about multiracialism in Singapore. Nation building is often thought of as processes that help to bridge local differences and often also to differentiate the nation from the rest of the world. However, this has been much more complicated in the case of Singapore, where an unsettled form of multiculturalism that uneasily blends pluralist and integrationist approaches prevails. The pluralist approach builds upon a colonial legacy of predefined racial communities living adjacent to one another in formal equality and state-policed harmony. The integrationist approach creates and seeks to entrench a new and overarching modern post-colonial Singaporean identity, strengthened by the bridges and bonds of social cohesion, which gives every member, regardless of their position and place in the plural society, a stake in the nation. This loose blend has come to be called multiracialism, and it is yet another ideological resource that the Singapore story draws upon frequently. There are three phases of multiracialism in Singapore. The first, melting pot phase, from the late 1950s to 1970s, witnessed attempts by the government to socially engineer a Singaporean identity by breaking down the hard distinctions between Chinese, Malays, and Indians, replacing biological and primordial notions of racial difference produced by colonial racial ideologies with more culturally based and therefore transformable notions of ethnicity. Some of the key national institutions set up to boost this social engineering project in Singapore included public housing, to give more than 80% of citizens a physical stake in the country, the vast majority of parastatal grassroots organizations to monitor and provide assistance to residents, mandatory military service to create a common set of masculine experiences oriented towards the defense of the country, and mass cultural national celebrations, of which the most spectacular have been the annual National Day parades. But the founding PAP elite were quite divided on how to proceed with multiracialism and nation building. By the 1980s, Singapore entered a mosaic phase. Here, the colonial idea of a plural society re-emerged, and racial categories, Chinese, Malays, Indians, others, became salient again in a rigidly proportioned and simplistically constructed model that has come to be known as CMIO. To anchor this re-racialized vision of society to an evolving national identity, Singaporeans assumed hyphenated identities. So Chinese Singaporeans, Malay Singaporeans, and Indian Singaporeans. This has become the hegemonic notion of Singaporean national identity since then. In 1999, then Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong, who was alarmed by and reacting in Parliament to some nationalist expressions emerging from a major public engagement exercise called Singapore 21, asserted in typical realist pragmatic vein. He said, "I wish to caution against unrealistic expectations and quick results. A strong dose of realism is necessary. A nation is not built in one generation, much less a country made up of different races and religions, who until recently were living in different racial enclaves." Now, in this speech, which was titled "The Singapore Tribe," Goh urged Singaporeans to think of nation and multiracialism in terms of overlapping circles. Singaporeans, especially in their private lives, were encouraged to anchor themselves to deeper cultural and moral identities related to being Chinese, Malays, Indians, or others, while the overlapped space constituting the public sphere would be where a common Singaporeanness could prevail and grow organically over time. This model assumed that Singaporeans were naturally still tribally divided, but their common national basis, though small, was sufficiently secure and would expand in its own time with encouragement from the state. CMIO has been the dominant model for managing ethnic diversity in Singapore, manifesting itself in the design of several policies and institutions. The Ethnic Integration Policy, or EIP, was introduced in 1989 to counter the emergence of ethnic enclaves in Singapore's public housing estates by imposing ethnic quotas for each neighborhood and each block of flats, with which buyers, sellers, and renters had to comply. Deputy Prime Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam identified this intrusive policy as the most important factor in explaining Singapore's success in reducing racial tension, promoting intermingling and interaction, and achieving social inclusion and stability. He argued that once people live together, he said, they're not just walking the corridors every day, taking the same elevator up and down. Their kids go to the same kindergarten, they go to the same primary school, because all over the world, young kids go to school very near where they live, and they grow up together. If we believe in social inclusion, if we believe in opportunities for all, we have to accept it doesn't happen automatically because of the invisible hand of the market or the invisible hand of society. It happens because you've got policies that seek to foster and encourage it. But the EIP has drawn criticisms too, not only for its intrusiveness. Some have argued that it is unfair to subject only public housing residents to this policy, while those living in private property, the so-called elite, are exempted from it. Also, the ethnic minority residents in public housing, who will often have a smaller pool to sell to, will generally be disadvantaged in the open market. A study has also shown that the specific impact of the policy on the behavior of target groups has been somewhat limited. Now, another set of institutions designed with CMIO in mind relates to the ethnic self-help groups, or SHG, mostly in place since the 1990s. Each ethnic community has its own SHG, funded by members' monthly contributions matched by government grants. The SHGs provide financial assistance, mainly for educational support, which is tailored to the specific needs of each ethnic community. They also organize activities for cultural and community development. Of some concern has been the idea that such organizations may be effective in bonding members within ethnic groups and customizing the use of state resources for the specific needs of each community, but these are achieved at the expense of strengthening bridges across ethnic groups for the larger nation-building project. Promoting stronger identification with ethnic groups can weaken national identity, national ties, and they may even cause division. One advantage of CMIO multiracialism is that it can keep minorities very visible and thus might prevent them from becoming engulfed by majoritarian interests, which seems consistent with the Singapore Constitution. The Constitution says, number one, It shall be the responsibility of the government constantly to care for the interests of the racial and religious minorities in Singapore. Number two, the government shall exercise its functions in such manner as to recognize the special position of the Malays, who are the indigenous people of Singapore, and accordingly it shall be the responsibility of the government to protect, safeguard, support, foster, and promote their political, educational, religious, economic, social, and cultural interests, and the Malay language. In 1970, the non-elected Presidential Council for Minority Rights was set up to scrutinize most bills passed in Parliament to ensure that they do not discriminate against racial and religious minority groups. Since the Council hardly ever caused any bill to be amended, it might be seen as having only symbolic significance. CMIO has also guided policy on political representation, as seen in the Group Representation Constituency, or the GRC system described earlier. Up until 1991, when the Constitution was amended to allow for presidents to be directly elected race-blind by the people, Singapore's presidents had been appointed by Parliament to play a largely ceremonial role as head of state. Guiding their selection was an informal principle of representing each CMIO group in succession. Thus, Yusof Ishak, a Malay, was president from 1965 to 1970. Benjamin Shears, a Eurasian, from 1971 to 1981. Devan Nair, an Indian, from 1981 to 1985. And Wee Kim Wee, a Chinese, from 1985 to 1993. In 2017, the Constitution was further amended, this time to take into account CMIO multiracialism in the elected presidency. A presidential election could be reserved for a specific racial community if, after 5 presidential terms, that community did not provide a president. The reserved elections would be deferred to the next round if no eligible candidates from the designated community could be found. A community committee has been set up to certify the candidate's race. The amendments also included a tightening of the eligibility criteria for private sector candidates who now needed to be a senior executive of a company with shareholders' equity of $500 million, increased from $100 million. The 2017 presidential elections, a particularly illustrative example of contradictions and tensions embedded in the CMIO framework, was reserved for the Malay community. 5 candidates submitted their applications. The community committee rejected 2 of them, both Chinese. Another 2, both Malay candidates working in the private sector, failed to meet the new eligibility criterion of $500 million, though they would have cleared the old criterion of $100 million. The only eligible candidate, and thus the winner of a walkover contest in September, was Halimah Yacob. She had been Speaker of Parliament and a PAP MP, and thus the PAP's preferred candidate, before resigning to run for president. Halimah is also Singapore's first woman president. CMIO multiracialism and policies that purport to protect the interests of ethnic minorities can sometimes grate against aspects of meritocracy, such as the principle of non-discrimination. According to this principle, policies should not differentiate people on the basis of their social backgrounds, but should instead pay attention to the competitive results of their effort and ability. In the case of Halimah for president, the ideological maneuver to manage this contradiction between CMIO multiracialism and meritocracy has involved, firstly, making an argument against a totally colorblind approach, since such an approach can ignore uncomfortable differences that may conceal structures of inequality, preventing those from disadvantaged social backgrounds, ignored to the principle of non-discrimination, from succeeding in an intrinsically biased competition. Thus, if the Malay community seems on average to have fallen behind in post-colonial Singapore, then acting as if this were not true in a politically correct, colorblind fashion would be deleterious to the Malay community. With systematically fewer opportunities and resources to compete against the majority Chinese community, the starting line for Malays in Singapore is thus not equal to that for the others. The counterexample to this is that while the average Malay may be disadvantaged in terms of capacity and performance compared to the average Chinese and even Indian, there are also elite Malays, such as Halimah Yacob, who can compete with the best of the other racial groups. If identities are considered in an intersectional way, it will be clear that upper middle class Chinese, Malays, and Indians are much more similar and comparable to one another than they might be to their own ethnic compatriots among the working classes. Secondly, the tension between CMIO and meritocracy may be managed by arguing that someone from an ethnic minority group, even though they may be equal or better in talent and effort when compared to someone from the majority group, may still need to overcome stereotypical images of themselves, externally imposed or even deeply internalized, in order to prosper in this system. Thirdly, even if the most talented and hardworking persons from the minority group manage to overcome the negative stereotypes that distort an objective assessment of their abilities, the majority may still be inclined to prefer one of their own, who may even be evidently inferior to the minority candidate. If any one of these considerations were true, the competition would not be fair, and an argument consistent with the principle of meritocracy can be made for correction through policy. Such arguments, controversial as they are, have been made in support of GRCs and the reserved elected presidency, which are really affirmative action style policies. Many Singaporeans have argued in social media that Halimah, humble, well-liked, and accomplished, could have credibly won the elections on her own merits, without requiring a reserved elections to protect her against the majority of Chinese voters who the government assumed would vote only for Chinese candidates. Although there was widespread use of the hashtag #NotMyPresident, many argued that they were not against Halimah herself, but against the new policy that robbed her of the credibility she could have earned on her own. It may also have robbed the Malay community of their dignity. In fact, minority candidates have in the past actually won single-member constituencies against Chinese candidates without enjoying a free ride on the GRC ticket. The problem seemed overstated, and many Singaporeans were indignant about the assumption that they had not yet evolved as a nation and still behaved according to tribal loyalties. To counter such arguments, the Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong noted in a speech that all four candidates contesting the presidential elections back in 2011 were Chinese. Lee's point that Singaporeans should have the honesty to recognize that our multiracialism is not yet perfect signals perhaps an uncomfortable truth that beneath the veneer of Singapore's much admired multiracial harmony are casual racism and day-to-day discriminatory behavior, mainly a result of racial privilege, exercised often at an unconscious level. Popular television shows and films reveal a pattern of stereotyping that privileges the Chinese viewer while situating minority characters in roles that are unflattering, marginal, or simply non-existent. For instance, in 2017, when an Indian actor expressed outrage at being asked to exaggerate his Indian accent and mannerisms at an audition for a part in a commercial Chinese language film, a heated debate broke out in public. Some of the sharpest criticisms had to do with the notion of Chinese privilege, theoretically derived from a more established critique of white privilege. This was a critical view that Chinese Singaporeans systematically benefit from numerous advantages every day, often without even knowing it, while the non-Chinese, who are in the minority, have to work much harder to overcome obstacles that are often invisible to the majority. Even worse, to be accepted by the majority, minority citizens have to behave as if such fundamental inequalities do not exist. Naturally, the very idea of Chinese privilege is deeply offensive to many in the Chinese community who would like to be respected for their achievements, particularly for those who also struggle to survive in a highly competitive society like Singapore. Even if the critics accepted that the problems of everyday racism, hidden privilege, and structural disadvantaged minorities were real and should not be ignored, they may still object to the realist approach of a pragmatic government that simply accepts this as an immutable fact of Singapore society. By formulating policies around these given parameters, the policies will have the effect of perpetuating the basic problem. They might question why the government cannot try to progressively transform society through its policies and other means, such as public education, instead of reifying differences and preserving the problems by working around them. Another type of popular criticism, rampant in social media discussions, has to do with consistency. First, race is a very complicated matter that can often confound bureaucratic attempts to define it, particularly according to simplistic models like CMIO that are unable to capture the complexities of mixed race identities, new ethnicities, and so on. Even though Halima's father was Indian and her mother Malay, the community committee accepted her claim to being classified as Malay in this patrilineal society. Secondly, if it is argued that there must be deliberate policies to interfere with the people's choice of political leaders in order to ensure CMIO representation, then why should this principle not also apply to the most powerful position of Prime Minister? Many Singaporeans, 69% of 897 polled by Black Box, for instance, have expressed enthusiastic support for DPM Tharman, an Indian, to become the next Prime Minister. Tharman is an impressive man, not only in terms of his public sector and political career in Singapore, but also for his international accomplishments. However, the government's stand has been to say that Singapore is not ready for a non-Chinese Prime Minister. Critics consider these kinds of responses to be not only inconsistent with the technocratic state's claim to meritocracy, but also hypocritical and revealing of the establishment's internal politicking.